Hey, so glad you got here. We were totally waiting for you, just about to listen to a story that begins with muddy roads, worn leather boots, lonely bell towers, and one forgotten shrine that almost no map remembers anymore. Somewhere beyond the last familiar village, where old footpaths vanish beneath moss and patient trees, a single traveler is about to discover that history has a habit of hiding its greatest secrets in places everyone else stopped looking. It is the sort of tale best enjoyed while the fire burns low and your eyelids begin negotiating with sleep. Don't worry, there will be no frantic battles to keep you awake. At worst, someone will have sore feet. And honestly, medieval roads were already doing enough damage without dragons joining the conversation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, leave a comment telling everyone where you're listening from and what your local time is. It's always fascinating to imagine this story traveling farther than any pilgrim ever could. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and just relax. Today's tale starts like this. There was once a man named Aldrin who walked not because he enjoyed walking, but because promises had a strange way of refusing to stay buried. His village rested between gentle hills where sheep outnumbered people by a rather embarrassing margin. If the sheep had learned to collect taxes, they probably would have run the place better than the local reeve. Fortunately for everyone, they seemed content with eating grass and judging humans silently. Aldrin had lived there all 34 years of his life. He repaired fences, he sharpened plow blades, he mended wagon wheels with the sort of patience that made neighbors believe he had been born middle-aged. No one expected adventures from a man who spent more time discussing broken hinges than distant kingdoms. Yet tucked inside a small leather pouch hanging beneath his tunic rested an object older than anyone in the village. It was a tiny carved stone disc. One side bore the faded image of a candle. The other showed an archway surrounded by vines. His grandfather had pressed it into his palm shortly before dying. "One day," the old man had whispered, "find the forgotten shrine." Naturally, young Aldrin had asked the obvious question. "Where is it?" His grandfather had smiled with all the confidence of a man providing absolutely no useful directions, beyond where people stop asking. Then he died. As final pieces of advice went, it ranked somewhere between mysterious wisdom and spectacularly unhelpful. Years passed. Life became wonderfully ordinary. Harvests came. Winter arrived. Spring chased winter away again. The stone remained hidden inside its pouch, while Aldrin convinced himself the old man's words belonged among bedtime stories and family legends. Until another winter changed everything. An elderly widow named Marta became ill. The village healer exhausted every herb growing within 3 valleys. Nothing seemed to help. One evening, while sitting beside her fire, Marta smiled weakly. "You still carry it." Aldrin instinctively touched the pouch beneath his tunic. "The stone?" She nodded. "Your grandfather spoke about it often." "You knew?" "He believed your family was keeping an old promise." "What promise?" She stared into the flames for so long that the crackling wood almost answered instead. "I don't think he knew anymore." That was somehow even stranger. Imagine spending generations protecting the key to something without remembering which door it opened. Still, before Aldrin left her cottage that evening, Marta whispered something else. "Some promises survive because someone eventually decides to keep them." Those words followed him home. They lingered while he repaired a broken gate. They echoed while feeding chickens. They returned every quiet evening when the wind rattled loose shutters. Eventually, ordinary life began feeling less peaceful and more unfinished. So, on a cool morning beneath grey skies, Aldrin packed lightly: a wool blanket, a water skin, a loaf of dark bread, dried apples, a small knife, needle and thread, a walking staff cut from ash wood, no gleaming sword, no heroic armor. Just practical things owned by practical people. His neighbors gathered as he prepared to leave. Most believed he was making a pilgrimage toward one of the famous monasteries farther east. A few assumed he intended to visit distant relatives. Only Marta understood otherwise. She pressed a little pouch of dried lavender into his hand. For sleep. I've never struggled sleeping. You will. That was not especially comforting. Still, he thanked her. As dawn painted pale gold across the hills, Aldrin stepped onto the old road leading away from everything familiar. The village disappeared slowly behind him. Stone cottages became dots. Smoke faded into morning mist. Church bells echoed once. Then silence claimed the countryside. There was something peculiar about walking alone. At first, every mile felt measured. Feet counted distance. Shoulders noticed every ounce inside the pack. The mind insisted on asking whether returning home might actually be the wiser decision. But after several hours, something changed. Thoughts stretched out like the road itself. The rhythm of footsteps became almost musical. Birdsong replaced conversation. Wind through oak branches sounded suspiciously like old people sharing secrets they assumed younger generations would never understand. By midday, he reached a crossroads marked by a weathered stone pillar. Most travelers continued east. Merchants, pilgrims, messengers, farmers. The southern path looked narrower. Grass pushed between forgotten wagon ruts. Few footprints disturbed the mud. An old wooden sign leaned crookedly. Any writing it once displayed had surrendered decades ago to rain and moss. Aldrin rested beside the marker, chewing bread while studying both roads. An elderly peddler arrived shortly afterward, pulling a stubborn donkey whose greatest talent seemed to involve stopping exactly whenever forward movement became desirable. The animal stared directly at Aldrin. Aldrin stared back. The donkey won. It somehow conveyed the unmistakable expression of someone disappointed in another person's life choices. The peddler sighed. Don't mind Bristle. Does he always look offended? Only when awake. That explained absolutely nothing. After convincing Bristle that civilization still existed farther along the road, the old merchant sat beside Aldrin. You headed east? Aldrin hesitated. I don't think so. The merchant followed his gaze toward the forgotten southern road. Haven't seen anyone choose that path in years. Does it lead anywhere? Oh, yes. Where? The old man scratched his beard thoughtfully. That's the interesting question. He smiled, not mockingly, but with genuine curiosity. My grandfather claimed monasteries once stood that way. And now? Trees. He stood, dusting crumbs from his cloak. Funny thing about abandoned places. What? They rarely stay empty. Before Aldrin could ask what that meant, Bristle abruptly decided walking sounded acceptable again. The merchant waved once before disappearing eastward. For several long moments, Aldrin remained seated. Then, almost without realizing why, he stood. His boots turned south. The narrower road welcomed him with silence. Overhead, ancient oaks intertwined their branches until sunlight filtered through in scattered patches of gold. The air smelled of damp earth, pine resin, and distant rain. Somewhere ahead, hidden beyond hills, no one in his village spoke about anymore, waited a forgotten shrine. Whether it held answers, old stones, or nothing at all, Aldrin could not yet know. But for the first time since leaving home, the carved stone resting against his chest felt unexpectedly warm. Not hot, not magical, simply warm. As though remembering the direction, long before he ever did. Morning arrived quietly. not with the triumphant fanfare that storytellers often grant a new day, but with damp grass, a chorus of birds arguing over entirely unimportant matters, and a stiff neck that reminded Aldrin why beds had remained one of humanity's better inventions. He unfolded himself from beneath an old oak with all the elegance of a folding stool refusing to cooperate. Every joint protested. Every muscle seemed determined to submit a formal complaint. He stretched until something in his back produced a satisfying pop. "There," he muttered to no one at all. Still alive. The forest, unconcerned by this remarkable achievement, continued breathing around him. Mist drifted lazily between the trunks. Spiderwebs collected tiny droplets that sparkled like strings of pearls. Somewhere nearby, a woodpecker enthusiastically attacked a tree with the confidence of someone convinced that if you simply hit a problem hard enough, answers would eventually appear. Aldrin admired the bird's optimism. After eating the last of yesterday's bread and washing it down with cool water from his skin, he resumed walking. The southern road was becoming less of a road and more of a suggestion. Grass reached his ankles. Roots crossed the path like sleeping serpents. Every now and then, he found broken stones peeking through the earth, remnants of paving laid generations ago by hands whose names had vanished long before the stones themselves. It struck him how strange memory could be. People forgot kings. They forgot battles. They forgot entire villages. Yet a single carved rock remained exactly where someone had placed it 200 years earlier. Perhaps stones were simply more patient than people. By mid-morning, he reached the remains of a small bridge. Half of it still stood proudly across a narrow stream. The other half appeared to have surrendered to gravity decades ago. Aldrin considered the gap. It wasn't impossible. It merely required confidence. Unfortunately, confidence and wisdom rarely traveled together. He tested the surviving beams with his walking staff. They creaked. He frowned. "They're only making conversation," he assured himself. The bridge disagreed. Very slowly, he crossed, placing each foot with deliberate care. Halfway across, one loose plank snapped beneath his heel. His arms flailed with surprising creativity. For one glorious heartbeat, he resembled an overly enthusiastic scarecrow attempting a dance. By some miracle, or perhaps sheer embarrassment, he regained his balance. When he finally reached solid ground, he turned to look back at the bridge. "I won," he informed it. The bridge remained unconvinced. Beyond the stream, the forest changed. The trees grew older. Their trunks widened until 3 men holding hands might still fail to encircle them. Moss climbed every surface. Fern-covered stones dotted the woodland floor. Sunlight reached the ground only in scattered patches, giving everything the appearance of being viewed through old stained glass. There was no fear in the place, only age, immense, quiet age. Around midday, he encountered another traveler. The man wore a faded brown cloak patched so many times that the original fabric had become difficult to identify. A bundle of willow baskets hung across his back. His beard was white enough to rival fresh snowfall, yet his eyes remained remarkably sharp. They greeted one another with the polite nod shared by strangers who understood that lonely roads encouraged simple kindness. "Good day," the basket maker said, "and to you." The old man studied Aldrin's boots. "You're headed deeper." "I believe so. Most people are headed the other direction." "So I've heard." The basket maker smiled. "Then perhaps you're searching instead of traveling." Aldrin considered answering. Instead, he asked, "Is there a difference?" "Oh, yes." The old craftsman adjusted the baskets on his shoulders. "A traveler usually knows where he'll sleep. And someone searching. He hopes." They walked together for a while. Conversation drifted naturally from weather to harvests, from unusually stubborn goats to the astonishing ability of ravens to steal anything shiny that wasn't nailed down. The basket maker claimed one particularly ambitious raven had once stolen an entire spoon from his supper. A spoon, a perfectly respectable spoon. What did the bird do with it? If I knew that, I'd have asked for it back. After sharing a laugh, silence settled comfortably between them. Eventually, the old man spoke again. "Have you ever heard of St. Edric's shrine?" Aldrin's heartbeat quickened. "No. Most haven't." The basket maker's voice became softer. "My grandmother used to tell stories." "What sort of stories?" "That there was once a shrine where pilgrims arrived carrying burdens too heavy for packs." Aldrin frowned. "What burdens?" "Guilt, grief, promises." The old man counted each word slowly. "They said people rarely left carrying the same weight they brought." A breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Aldrin asked, "Where was this shrine?" The basket maker pointed somewhere beyond the endless trees. "No one agrees anymore." "Did it truly exist?" He chuckled. "My boy, there are 3 kinds of places. The ones everyone remembers, the ones everyone forgets, and the ones memory itself cannot quite decide about." He stopped beside a narrow fork where another trail branched west. "My road ends here." "So soon?" "My customers enjoy baskets. They become considerably less enthusiastic if I never arrive." Aldrin smiled. "Fair enough." Before leaving, the old craftsman reached into one basket and withdrew a small woven charm, no larger than a child's hand. It was made from willow strips, braided into the shape of a circle. "Take this." "I can't." "You can." "But why?" "Because every pilgrim should carry something made by another pair of hands." Aldrin accepted the gift carefully. "Thank you." The basket maker tipped his head. "If you find the old shrine," he paused, "tell it someone still remembers." Then he disappeared along the western trail until only the gentle swaying of branches revealed where he had gone. For the rest of the afternoon, Aldrin found himself thinking about forgotten places. What happened when enough people stopped speaking a name? Did the place become lonely? Or did it simply grow quieter, content to wait? Late in the day, the forest finally opened. Ahead lay the ruins of a tiny hamlet. Perhaps a dozen cottages had once stood there. Now roofs had collapsed. Doorways leaned at impossible angles. Wildflowers grew inside abandoned hearths. An apple orchard, long untended, still produced fruit. The trees twisted into curious shapes, their branches heavy with small green apples. Aldrin picked one. It was astonishingly sour. His face folded into an expression so dramatic that even a nearby squirrel appeared mildly concerned. "Well," he coughed after another bite, "that's certainly a wake." He laughed at himself. The sound echoed strangely through the empty village. Near the center stood a stone well. Its bucket had rotted away decades before, but cool water remained below. After carefully lowering his water skin with a length of rope from his pack, he refilled it. As he prepared to leave, something caught his eye. A weathered carving on the well's outer stones. Not words, a symbol, an archway, wrapped in climbing vines, exactly like the carving on the stone disc, hidden beneath his tunic. His breath caught. Slowly, he removed the family token. He held both symbols side by side. Time had worn them differently, yet they were unmistakably the same. Someone had marked this forgotten hamlet with the sign of the shrine, meaning pilgrims had once passed through here, many of them, long ago. The discovery sent a quiet thrill through him, not excitement born of treasure, but the reassuring feeling that a half-remembered promise was beginning to leave footprints. As evening approached, Aldrin climbed a low hill overlooking the abandoned settlement. Beyond it, stretching toward the horizon, lay a broad valley wrapped in silver mist. Through that mist, Just for an instant, he thought he saw the outline of an ancient bell tower rising above the trees. He blinked. It vanished. Perhaps it had only been another stand of pines. Perhaps fatigue was playing tricks upon him, or perhaps some places preferred to introduce themselves slowly. He pulled his cloak tighter against the cooling air and continued toward the valley, where every step seemed to carry him a little farther from the world he had always known, and a little closer to the promise that had waited for him all his life. The valley greeted Aldrin with the kind of silence that made even careful footsteps seem unexpectedly loud. Not an empty silence, not the uneasy quiet that settled after storms or arguments. This was older. It was the silence of places that had listened for centuries and had long ago decided there was little need to interrupt. Morning sunlight drifted over the hills in thin ribbons of gold, dissolving the last of the mist that had filled the valley before dawn. Tiny beads of dew clung to every blade of grass, turning the meadows into fields of scattered glass. A pair of hares darted across the path ahead, disappearing into tall ferns without so much as acknowledging the traveler who had wandered into their kingdom. Aldrin descended slowly. The air felt different here, cooler, not because of the weather, but because the valley held shade, long after neighboring hills had welcomed the sun. The road, if it could still be called that, continued in faint traces through the grass. Every few hundred paces, he noticed another carefully shaped stone standing beside the path. Most leaned crookedly. Some had toppled completely. Nearly all were covered in moss. Curiosity overcame him. He knelt beside the first one. Beneath years of green growth, his fingers uncovered a shallow carving, an archway, wrapped in vines. Again, the same symbol. He smiled despite himself. At least he was no longer chasing nothing. Someone had once guided travelers through this valley. The markers proved it. He brushed more moss away. Beneath the archway appeared another carving, this one almost invisible. A candle, its flame rising toward the sky. The very same images carved onto the small stone, token resting against his chest. His grandfather had not imagined them. Neither had the basket-maker's grandmother. The forgotten shrine had truly existed. Whether it still stood remained another question. He rose and continued, paying closer attention to the landscape. Soon he noticed details that would have escaped him only a day earlier. Low ridges beneath the grass that looked suspiciously like buried walls. Lines of ancient oak trees planted too evenly to be natural. Flat stones half swallowed by earth where buildings may once have stood. This valley had once been alive, not crowded, not wealthy, but lived in. It reminded him of an old manuscript whose ink had faded almost beyond recognition. The words were gone. Only impressions remained. Around midday, he reached the remains of a stone gateway. No gate survived. Only two weathered pillars rising from either side of the forgotten road. One had cracked nearly in half. The other leaned enough to make any sensible mason extremely uncomfortable. Carved into the top of each pillar sat birds unlike any Aldrin recognized. Their wings folded tightly, their heads turned toward the valley rather than outward, as though watching those who entered instead of guarding those who left. He reached up and brushed away loose lichen. The carving beneath was astonishingly delicate despite its age. Whoever had sculpted these stones had cared deeply about details no traveler would ever notice from a distance. That thought lingered. Someone had spent weeks, perhaps months, chiseling feathers that strangers would barely glance at before continuing on their way. There was something quietly beautiful about such work, to labor carefully even when applause was unlikely. He passed beneath the gateway. Nothing happened. No mysterious wind, no heavenly music, no glowing light. Just one crow perched on a nearby branch. It looked directly at him, tilted its head, then flew away. Well, Aldrin sighed. I appreciate your enthusiasm. The crow offered no reply, probably for the best. He had already spent enough time talking to bridges. By afternoon, the valley widened. Wildflowers spread across gentle slopes. Bluebells nodded beneath the breeze. Golden buttercups clustered beside the road. White daisies filled open patches of sunlight. Bees drifted lazily from blossom to blossom with admirable dedication. Watching them reminded Aldrin of the village miller. Not because the miller resembled a bee, quite the opposite. The miller possessed a remarkable talent for avoiding work whenever witnesses were present. The bees would have found him deeply disappointing. He laughed softly. The sound disappeared into the open valley. As he rounded another bend, something unusual caught his eye. Rows, perfect rows, stone blocks, barely visible beneath the grass. He approached cautiously. They formed neat rectangles, foundations. Several buildings had once stood here, one larger than the others. Nearby lay fragments of roof tiles, pieces of broken pottery, a rusted horseshoe, half of a millstone, almost completely buried in soil. Nature had reclaimed everything patiently, one season at a time. Aldrin crouched beside the pottery. Its surface still carried traces of blue paint. He imagined the potter carefully decorating it centuries ago, perhaps pleased with the finished bowl, perhaps annoyed because the glaze hadn't turned out exactly right, never suspecting that one day a stranger would admire the broken pieces after every person who had eaten from it had been forgotten. History, he realized, was often built from leftovers. Toward the center of the abandoned settlement stood something unexpected, a massive lime tree. Its trunk twisted into broad spirals. Its branches stretched so widely they cast shade across nearly half the clearing. The tree was enormous, far older than any Aldrin had ever seen. Its bark bore dozens of shallow cuts, not damage, marks. Someone had deliberately carved tiny symbols into the trunk over many generations. Most had blurred with age. One remained perfectly clear, an archway, wrapped in vines. Below it appeared a single word. He struggled to read the worn letters. After several attempts, they finally revealed themselves. Remember, only that, nothing more. No names, no dates, no explanations, just one quiet instruction. Remember. The simplicity unsettled him more than any grand inscription might have. He rested beneath the tree while eating dried apples. The shade felt wonderfully cool. A breeze stirred the leaves overhead, producing a gentle whisper, unlike the rustling of oaks. For a moment, it almost resembled distant voices, not words, only rhythm. The old stories returned to his thoughts. Pilgrims carrying grief, caretakers disappearing, a forgotten sanctuary somewhere ahead. He removed the willow charm the basket maker had given him. Its woven circle fit neatly around the stone, token from his grandfather, entirely by accident, or perhaps not. The two objects looked as though they belonged together. He smiled. Someone would probably call that a sign. He tucked both safely away again. A curious little fact his grandfather had once shared drifted back into memory. In some medieval communities, travelers tied ribbons, woven grass, or small wooden tokens to sacred trees instead of leaving coins. The gift wasn't payment. It was simply a way of saying, I passed here, and I hope someone after me finds peace as well. Aldrin rather liked that custom. It seemed kinder than monuments. As afternoon leaned toward evening, the road began climbing once more. This time the valley narrowed. Steep hills rose on either side. Rocky cliffs peeked through the trees. Water trickled somewhere ahead. Not a river, a spring. The sound grew clearer with every step. Finally, he found it. Crystal water emerged from beneath a shelf of stone, flowing into a shallow basin carved directly into the rock. The basin itself was unmistakably shaped by human hands. Its rim carried the familiar vine motif. Yet there were no signs of recent visitors, no footprints, no ashes, no broken branches, only moss. The water tasted wonderfully cold, sweeter than any he had drunk since leaving home. As he stood, droplets still clinging to his beard, movement caught the corner of his eye. Across the stream, between two ancient yew trees, for the briefest instant, a figure, someone wearing a pale cloak, standing perfectly still, watching. Aldrin blinked. The figure was gone. He crossed immediately. Nothing, only trees, fern-covered stones, birdsong. He searched the area carefully. No footprints marked the damp earth. No snapped twigs suggested another traveler. Perhaps the shifting light had deceived him. Perhaps tired eyes had mistaken pale bark for cloth. Still, he found himself glancing over his shoulder more often as evening approached. Not from fear, from curiosity. The valley no longer felt abandoned. Instead, it carried the quiet sensation that someone, or something, had noticed his arrival long before he noticed theirs. Ahead, beyond another rise, the trees thickened once more. Hidden somewhere beyond them, Aldrin sensed he was drawing ever closer to the place his grandfather had spoken of so many years before. The forgotten shrine was no longer just a story. Its memory was written into stones, trees, and forgotten roads, and the valley, patient as ever, seemed content to reveal its secrets. One careful step at a time. The path climbed gently beyond the spring, winding between ancient yew trees whose branches leaned together high overhead. Their dark needles softened the daylight until the afternoon seemed older than it truly was, as though the forest had quietly borrowed an extra hour from evening. Aldrin walked without hurrying. The farther he traveled into the valley, the less he felt like a visitor passing through, and the more he felt like someone reading the middle pages of a very old book. Every stone, every tree, every forgotten carving seemed connected to a story whose beginning had been lost centuries before. The spring's cool water lingered pleasantly on his tongue. His shoulders felt lighter than they had that morning. Perhaps it was simply because he had become accustomed to the weight of his pack. Or perhaps Marta had been right. Some journeys began changing a person long before they reached their destination. The woodland grew quieter, not silent. There remained the steady hum of insects, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional flutter of wings overhead. But something else had changed. There were fewer signs of ordinary animals. No rabbits darted across the path. No squirrels scolded him from branches. Even the birds seemed content to sing from farther away. It was not an unpleasant stillness, only unusual. He rounded another bend. The path narrowed between two towering boulders covered in emerald moss. Beyond them stood a flight of broad stone steps. Aldrin stopped. The steps climbed toward a ridge, hidden behind thick ivy and low-hanging branches. Grass had claimed their edges. Tiny white flowers grew between the cracks. Several stones had shifted out of place after generations of frost and rain. Yet despite everything, the staircase remained unmistakably deliberate. Someone had built this, carefully, with purpose. He climbed slowly. Each footstep released the faint scent of damp moss, warming beneath the afternoon sun. Near the top, he noticed shallow grooves worn into the middle of every step. Thousands of feet, perhaps tens of thousands. Pilgrims, monks, travelers, children, old men leaning on staffs, women carrying offerings. Centuries of quiet devotion had polished the stone more effectively than any craftsman's tools. He paused halfway up. Closing his eyes, he imagined the staircase alive again. Voices, soft prayers, laughter from families traveling together, the creak of wagon wheels below, the ringing of a distant bell. Then he opened his eyes. Only wind remained, yet somehow the place no longer felt empty. It felt waiting, At the top of the stairs, the trees parted. For several heartbeats, Aldrin simply stood. Before him rested the forgotten shrine. It was smaller than the grand monasteries described by wandering merchants, far smaller. No towering cathedral pierced the sky, no glittering stained glass reflected the sun. Instead, a modest stone chapel stood nestled against the hillside, embraced by ivy, so thick that entire walls had disappeared beneath green leaves. Its roof sagged, but still held. A weathered bell tower leaned slightly to one side, as though age had persuaded it to rest without quite lying down. A narrow archway marked the entrance. Its stones carried the same carved vines found throughout the valley. For the first time since leaving home, Aldrin forgot to breathe. It existed. After all the stories, after generations of fading memory, after roads abandoned and villages emptied, the shrine had endured, quietly, patiently. He stepped forward almost reluctantly, unwilling to disturb the remarkable peace surrounding the place. The grass reached nearly to his knees. Wildflowers had claimed the old courtyard. Bees floated lazily between blossoms growing where pilgrims had once gathered. A single ash tree shaded one corner of the grounds, its roots gently lifting ancient paving stones, one finger width at a time. Nature had not destroyed the shrine. It had simply wrapped it in careful protection. Near the entrance stood a weathered stone basin. Rainwater filled it almost to the brim. Floating on its surface rested several oak leaves. Aldrin brushed one aside. Beneath the water appeared another familiar carving. A candle, its flame perfectly preserved despite the passing centuries. He smiled. Someone had loved symbols here. Perhaps because symbols survived where words faded. The great wooden doors stood closed. At least, what remained of them. One had slipped from its hinges and leaned awkwardly against the doorway. The other remained attached, though vines threaded through its iron fittings. Aldrin rested his hand against the aged oak. The wood felt surprisingly solid. Taking a slow breath, he pushed. The hinges answered with a long, tired groan that echoed gently through the chapel. Dust danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through broken roof tiles. Cool air drifted outward, carrying the scent of old stone, dry timber, beeswax, and something faintly herbal, lavender, or perhaps rosemary. Scents could linger astonishingly long inside ancient buildings. He stepped inside. His boots stirred only a thin layer of dust. The floor consisted of smooth stone slabs worn by countless generations. Simple wooden benches lined each side of the room. Most remained upright. One had collapsed into a neat pile of weathered boards. At the far end stood a modest stone altar. No gold, no jeweled relics, no elaborate carvings demanding admiration. Only clean lines and quiet craftsmanship. Above it hung a faded mural. Time had stolen nearly all its colors. Yet enough remained to reveal travelers walking beneath an archway wrapped in vines toward a distant light. The same symbol again. Always the archway, always the vines. Aldrin wandered slowly through the chapel. Everything invited observation rather than astonishment. He ran his fingertips lightly across one wall. Tiny carvings covered the stone. Names. Hundreds of them. Pilgrims had scratched them gently into the surface over generations, some elegant, some clumsy, some so faint they had nearly vanished. One name caught his attention. Edwin, another. Mathia, another. John. Ordinary people. Not kings, not bishops, not famous warriors, just travelers wishing to leave behind proof that they had once stood in this very place. It struck Aldrin how deeply human that desire was. To be remembered, even if only by strangers, centuries later. A curious little detail rested near one corner. A shallow groove ran through the stone floor toward the doorway. Following it with his eyes, Aldrin realized it connected to a tiny drain outside. Rainwater entering through damaged roof tiles would naturally flow away instead of pooling inside. Whoever designed the chapel had thought not only about worship, but about practical maintenance. Faith, apparently, appreciated good drainage. He approved. As any wheelwright would tell you, sturdy foundations were every bit as holy as fine decorations. A sudden flutter interrupted his thoughts. Several swallows burst from the rafters overhead. They circled the chapel once before slipping through a broken window into the afternoon sky. Aldrin laughed quietly. "You startled me more than I startled you." The empty chapel offered no argument. He approached the altar. Resting upon its surface lay a single object, almost hidden beneath dust. A small bronze candle holder, green with age. Carefully lifting it, he discovered the metal remained surprisingly intact. Simple vines circled its base. No jewels, no ornament beyond patient craftsmanship. He imagined someone placing it there on an ordinary evening centuries ago, intending to return after supper. Life had interrupted. Years had followed. Empires had changed. Yet the candle holder had waited exactly where it had been left. There was something profoundly moving about that. Not sadness, stillness. Outside, distant thunder rumbled beyond the hills. Aldrin glanced toward the doorway. Dark clouds were gathering. Rain would arrive before long. He looked back at the quiet chapel. Its roof might leak. Its walls leaned ever so slightly. Its doors protested every movement. Yet it remained shelter. A place built by forgotten hands for weary travelers, exactly like himself. He set down his pack. Perhaps he would spend the night here. Not because he had planned to, because somehow it already felt as though the shrine had been expecting company. Rain arrived with remarkable politeness. There was no violent crash of thunder announcing its importance, no furious wind attempting to uproot half the forest in the name of dramatic storytelling. Instead, the first drops tapped gently against the chapel roof, as though asking permission before settling in for the evening. Aldrin stood in the doorway, watching the valley disappear behind a silver curtain. The hills softened. The distant trees became little more than dark silhouettes. The worn stone steps leading down from the shrine glistened as tiny streams carried rainwater into the grass below. The air filled with the rich scent of wet earth. It reminded him of spring planting back home. Every farmer knew that smell. Some claimed they could predict a good harvest simply by breathing deeply after the season's first rain. Whether that was true or not remained a matter of cheerful debate, and farmers could debate almost anything if supper was still an hour away. Satisfied that the storm showed no sign of passing quickly, Aldrin gathered several loose boards that had fallen from the collapsed bench. He carefully stacked them beside the stone altar. The wood was old but dry enough to burn. Near the rear wall, he discovered an ancient fireplace built into a shallow alcove. Its chimney remained intact. Someone had designed the chapel to shelter travelers through every season. He smiled. They thought of everything. Well, almost everything. The roof still leaked in 3 places. One steady drip landed directly onto the floor with impressive determination. Plink, plink, plink. Aldrin shifted his bedroll 3 feet to the left. Problem solved. Sometimes the greatest engineering achievements required remarkably little engineering. Using flint from his travel pouch, he coaxed a small fire to life. The flames spread slowly across the old timber, filling the chapel with welcome warmth. Orange light danced across worn stone walls, bringing faded carvings back into gentle relief. The names scratched into the masonry seemed almost alive now, each briefly catching the glow before surrendering it to the next. He unpacked the last of his dried apples and a wedge of hard cheese wrapped in cloth. Not exactly a feast fit for a lord, but after 2 days on forgotten roads, it tasted magnificent. While eating, his eyes wandered once more across the chapel. In daylight, he had admired the building. In firelight, it revealed different details, tiny imperfections, tool marks left by masons centuries earlier, places where one stone sat ever so slightly crooked, the faint outline of painted vines climbing around a window arch. Nothing grand, everything personal. It occurred to him that whoever had built this place had probably never expected strangers to marvel at it hundreds of years later. They had simply wanted to do good work. That thought lingered pleasantly. Outside, rain continued its quiet conversation with the roof. Inside, the fire crackled softly. For the first time since leaving home, Aldrin felt completely at ease. Eventually, curiosity persuaded him to explore the chapel more carefully. He carried the bronze candle holder toward the altar once again. Behind it stood a shallow stone shelf carved directly into the wall. Most of its contents had long since vanished. A broken clay cup remained. So did several fragments of yellowed beeswax. Near the back rested something wrapped in faded linen. His pulse quickened. The cloth practically dissolved when touched. Inside lay a small wooden box, no larger than both hands placed together. Its lid bore the familiar archway wrapped in vines. There was no lock, only age. Carefully, Aldrin lifted it open. Inside rested nothing valuable. At least not in the way merchants judged value. Several dried lavender stems, a handful of smooth river stones, 3 tiny wooden prayer beads, a folded strip of parchment so brittle he dared not unfold it, and beneath everything else, a simple iron key. He picked it up. It was surprisingly heavy, old, beautifully forged. Its bow formed the shape of intertwining branches. Its teeth looked unlike any ordinary household key he had ever seen. A key, he whispered. But to what? Certainly not the chapel doors. Those hadn't possessed a lock in decades. He searched nearby walls for hidden chests or cupboards. Nothing. Still, he slipped the key carefully into his pouch. If someone had preserved it inside the shrine, there had likely been a reason. As evening deepened, the rain finally eased. Only occasional droplets continued falling from the trees outside. A cool breeze drifted through the open doorway, carrying the fresh scent of pine. Aldrin decided to walk briefly around the grounds before darkness settled completely. The world after rain possessed a remarkable clarity. Leaves shimmered, stone glistened, birdsong gradually returned. Near the rear of the chapel, he discovered what he had somehow overlooked earlier: a small graveyard. No elaborate monuments stood there. Only simple stone markers arranged in quiet rows. Most had weathered beyond recognition. Lichen covered nearly every inscription. He knelt before the nearest. After brushing away moss with gentle fingers, a few words became readable. Brother Thomas, servant and keeper. No dates, only those 3 words. He moved to another. Sister Elswith, faithful guide. Another. Brother Rowan, Pilgrim's friend. Aldrin noticed something unusual. None of the stones listed titles of rank. No abbots, no priors, no noble patrons. Instead, each remembered service: keeper, guide, friend. The shrine, it seemed, had valued kindness more than status. He found that strangely comforting. One grave stood apart from the others beneath an ancient yew tree. Unlike the rest, it carried no name at all, only the familiar carved archway, wrapped in vines. Below it appeared 3 simple words. He returned home. Nothing more. No explanation. Aldrin stared for a long while. He wasn't entirely sure why the inscription affected him so deeply. Perhaps because it suggested that home meant something greater than a village or a house. Or perhaps because whoever rested beneath that stone no longer required any other introduction. As twilight settled across the valley, an owl called from somewhere beyond the trees. Another answered farther away. The sounds echoed softly through the damp evening. Returning toward the chapel, Aldrin noticed something peculiar. Fresh footprints, very faint, leading across the wet grass. He froze. They had not been there before the rain. Of that, he was certain. The impressions were narrow, bare feet, small enough to belong to either a young person or a slight adult. They emerged from the woods, crossed the courtyard, reached the chapel steps, then stopped, not turned, not continued, stopped, as though whoever had made them had simply vanished. He crouched to examine them more closely. The edges remained crisp. They could not be more than an hour old. He followed every nearby patch of ground. No further tracks appeared. The wet grass showed nothing. The muddy earth revealed nothing. Only those quiet prints ending at the first stone step. A chill, not of fear, but of wonder, slipped across his shoulders. He looked around slowly. The valley remained peaceful. The trees stood motionless. The chapel watched in patient silence. At last, he gave a small shrug. "If you're here," he said softly to the empty courtyard, "I hope the rain didn't soak you." It felt like an oddly sensible thing to say. No answer came. Only a gentle breeze stirred the ivy climbing the old walls. Back inside, Aldrin added another piece of wood to the fire. He placed the mysterious iron key beside his pack. Then, before lying down, he looked once more around the chapel. His gaze settled on the faded mural above the altar. Earlier, he had seen only pilgrims walking beneath the vine-covered archway. Now, illuminated by flickering firelight, he noticed something he had missed. One figure in the painting carried a key, exactly like the one resting beside his bedroll. The fire cracked softly. Outside, the last raindrops fell from the roof, and somewhere within the forgotten shrine, another piece of its long-buried story had quietly begun to reveal itself. Dawn arrived wrapped in pale gray clouds, and for a few quiet moments, Aldrin could not remember where he was. The ceiling above him was unfamiliar. Heavy wooden beams crossed beneath worn roof tiles, their surfaces darkened by centuries of smoke from countless small fires. Thin shafts of morning light slipped through tiny gaps overhead, carrying dancing specks of dust that floated lazily through the chapel like drifting seeds. Then memory returned. The forgotten shrine, the rain, the footprints, the iron key. He sat upright, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The fire had dwindled to a bed of warm embers, still glowing faintly beneath white ash. The chapel smelled pleasantly of damp stone, charred oak, and the faint sweetness of old beeswax. Outside, birds had begun their morning chorus. Apparently, whatever agreement they held about singing at sunrise required enthusiastic participation from every feathered resident of the valley. A particularly confident, robin landed on the broken doorway and chirped loudly enough to suggest that silence had become terribly unfashionable overnight. Aldrin smiled. "I suppose that's breakfast announced." The robin seemed satisfied with its performance and flew away. After rekindling the fire long enough to warm a little water, Aldrin ate the last of his cheese while studying the iron key resting beside his pack. In daylight, it appeared even more carefully made. Tiny vines curled around its stem. Near the bow, barely visible beneath patches of rust, someone had engraved 3 tiny stars. Not decorative stars, purposeful ones. Each had 6 points. He turned the key over slowly. No maker's mark, no initials, only the stars and the vines. If it unlocked something within the shrine, that something had remained hidden remarkably well. His eyes wandered toward the faded mural above the altar. Sure enough, there it was. The painted pilgrim still carried a long iron key tucked beneath his cloak. It had not been imagination. The artist had included it deliberately, which meant the key mattered. The question was why. Before searching further, Aldrin decided the neglected chapel deserved at least a little care. He found an old broom leaning behind the collapsed bench. Its handle remained solid, though the bristles had worn short with age. Still useful, he observed. The broom, displaying admirable modesty, accepted the compliment without comment. For the next hour, he swept away years of leaves, dust, and loose plaster. The work was slow, but satisfying. Sunlight gradually reached more of the stone floor. The carved names along the walls became easier to read. Even the chapel itself seemed somehow relieved. It was astonishing how much difference simple tidiness could make. His mother had always claimed that sweeping a room cleared the mind as much as the floor. As a boy, Aldrin had assumed that was simply clever encouragement to help with chores. Now he wasn't entirely certain she had been wrong. Near the entrance, hidden beneath a pile of fallen ivy, he uncovered another curious detail, a circular stone set into the floor. Unlike the surrounding paving slabs, this one bore a compass-like design. At its center appeared the familiar archway. Radiating outward stretched 8 narrow lines. Each pointed toward one of the directions: north, south, east, west, and the spaces between. The carving had been worn nearly smooth by centuries of passing feet. He crouched beside it. Something about its proportions seemed intentional. Without thinking, he removed the iron key from his pouch. The bow fit perfectly over the central carving, not inserted, simply resting there. As though the two objects had been designed together. Nothing happened. No hidden doorway creaked open. No stone shifted dramatically. Aldrin chuckled. I suppose that would have been too easy. Still, he carefully memorized the pattern before returning the key to his belt. If there were more carvings elsewhere, perhaps together they would reveal something. Stepping outside, he began exploring the grounds more thoroughly. Morning sunlight had chased away yesterday's rain, leaving every leaf sparkling. Butterflies drifted among the wildflowers. Bees resumed their tireless work. The valley felt wonderfully alive. Near the graveyard, he discovered the remains of what had once been a vegetable garden. Low stone borders still outlined neat planting beds. Mint grew wildly between them. So did sage, rosemary. Even a few stubborn onions had somehow survived untended for years, their green shoots pushing bravely through the soil. Aldrin laughed softly. Remarkable. The onions, as onions often do, appeared entirely uninterested in receiving praise. He picked a few herbs, rubbing them gently between his fingers. Their fragrance filled the air. The keepers who had once lived here had grown their own medicines as well as their meals. A practical place. Nothing wasted. Behind the garden stood the crumbling remains of several small buildings. Their roofs had long since collapsed, leaving only waist-high stone walls. One had clearly been a kitchen. Fragments of blackened cooking pots lay scattered among nettles. Another appeared to have been a workshop. Rusted tools rested exactly where someone had laid them centuries before. A hammer, a pair of tongs, a broken chisel. Their wooden handles had vanished long ago. The iron endured. While examining the workshop, Aldrin noticed faint scratches on one surviving wall. Not random marks, measurements. Someone had carved simple lines showing lengths of timber. Beside them appeared notes written in faded Latin. He could read only a few words. Repair. Roof. Before winter. He smiled again. Even forgotten holy places had maintenance lists. Somewhere, centuries ago, a weary carpenter had probably sighed exactly as Aldrin often did before fixing a stubborn fence. History, it seemed, had far more in common with ordinary life than grand stories admitted. Beyond the ruined buildings, a narrow footpath climbed toward a rocky hillside. It looked older than the main road, less traveled, almost hidden beneath ferns. Curiosity won. Following it upward, Aldrin soon reached a natural ledge overlooking the entire valley. From there, the forgotten shrine appeared peaceful beyond words. The ivy-covered chapel nestled among trees. The graveyard rested beneath the ancient yews. The stone staircase wound gracefully down toward the valley floor. Looking from above, he finally understood why the shrine had been built here. The surrounding hills formed a broad circle, sheltering the place from harsh winds. A spring flowed through the center. Fruit trees dotted the lower slopes. It was secluded without being barren. Perfect for travelers seeking quiet. As he admired the view, something unusual caught the morning sun. A flash, not metal, glass. Far across the valley, partially hidden among dense trees, sunlight reflected from a narrow window. A building, or what remained of one. He narrowed his eyes. The reflection vanished almost immediately as the sun shifted. Yet he was certain another structure stood somewhere beyond the woods. Perhaps a hermit's hut, perhaps an old storehouse, or perhaps something connected to the shrine. His hand instinctively rested upon the iron key. Whatever secrets remained buried in this forgotten valley, they clearly extended beyond the chapel itself. With renewed determination, Aldrin began descending the hillside. The day had only just begun. And somewhere beyond the trees, another forgotten chapter of the shrine's history was waiting patiently to be found. By the time Aldrin reached the foot of the hillside again, the morning had settled into one of those clear autumn days that seemed almost too perfect to hurry through. The rain had washed every leaf clean. The sky stretched overhead in a deep, gentle blue. Even the breeze moved with unusual care, carrying the scent of pine, rosemary, and damp stone from the shrine behind him. He paused at the edge of the old courtyard and looked back once. The chapel stood quietly beneath its blanket of ivy. From this angle, it appeared less like an abandoned building and more like an old friend, patiently waiting on a familiar doorstep. "I'll be back before evening," he said aloud. Whether he was speaking to the chapel or to himself, he wasn't entirely sure. The narrow trail toward the distant flash of glass was barely visible. It wandered between hazel bushes before disappearing beneath tall beeches whose smooth silver trunks rose like pillars supporting a ceiling of green. The ground was soft with years of fallen leaves. Each step released the earthy fragrance of rich soil, slowly becoming tomorrow's forest. The deeper he walked, the older the woods appeared. Many trees bore scars from lightning. Long ago healed over. Others had grown together, their trunks twisting around one another until they resembled old friends, leaning shoulder to shoulder after a long conversation. Nature, Aldrin thought, had remarkable patience. Around midday, he found another carved stone beside the path. Unlike the markers below in the valley, this one had fallen flat. Moss almost completely concealed it. After brushing the surface clean, he recognized the familiar vine-covered archway. Beneath it, however, was a different carving. A lantern, its flame enclosed within protective glass. He frowned thoughtfully. The shrine had used candles. The road leading toward it displayed candles. But this path displayed lanterns. Perhaps they meant nothing, or perhaps the symbols marked different destinations. He ran his fingers gently across the worn carving. The lantern faced uphill. He decided to continue in that direction. Not long afterward, the trail crossed a narrow stream flowing over smooth stones. A small wooden footbridge still spanned the water. Unlike the bridge he had crossed days earlier, this one remained remarkably sturdy. Someone had repaired it, not recently, but certainly more recently than the abandoned chapel. He examined the timber. The axe marks looked perhaps 20 or 30 years old. No more. Someone had visited this part of the valley within living memory. The thought filled him with cautious excitement. Maybe the shrine had never been entirely forgotten after all. Crossing the bridge, he noticed tiny fish darting beneath the clear water. Dragonflies hovered just above the surface, their wings flashing blue whenever sunlight caught them. A kingfisher shot downstream like a streak of sapphire before vanishing around a bend. For several minutes, Aldrin simply watched. His grandfather had often said that people walked past miracles every day because they expected miracles to make more noise. Perhaps he had been right. A bird diving into a stream required no fanfare to be extraordinary. Farther uphill, the trees gradually thinned. Sunlight reached the forest floor, more easily here, encouraging patches of soft grass and clusters of tiny purple flowers. Bees drifted lazily among them. One particularly determined bee investigated Aldrin's sleeve for several moments before deciding it lacked useful nectar. "I appreciate the inspection," he said. The bee buzzed away without filing an official report. By early afternoon, he reached the source of yesterday's mysterious reflection. Hidden among the trees stood a tiny stone building. It was no larger than a shepherd's cottage. Its roof remained intact. Its walls leaned only slightly. A single narrow window faced east, the one that had caught the morning sun. Unlike the chapel, ivy had not consumed this place. Instead, climbing roses covered much of the stonework. Though wild now, they still produced delicate pale blossoms. Someone had planted beauty here, intentionally. Aldrin approached slowly. The wooden door stood closed. Above it hung another carved symbol. Not the archway, not the candle, not the lantern. A simple open hand, palm facing outward. A gesture of welcome, or perhaps of blessing. He rested his fingers upon the latch. It lifted easily. The door opened inward without complaint. Inside waited a library, or what had once been one. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling. Many had collapsed. Most books had long since surrendered to dampness, insects, and time. Fragments of leather bindings rested among piles of brittle parchment. The room smelled wonderfully of old paper, cedar wood, and dried herbs. Sunlight filtered through the narrow window, illuminating floating dust that shimmered like tiny stars. Near the center stood a broad reading table. Unlike everything else, it remained surprisingly well preserved. Someone had covered it with a thick linen cloth before leaving many years ago. The fabric had yellowed with age, but had protected the wood beneath. Aldrin carefully lifted one corner. The oak surface looked almost new. Beside the table rested a single chair. One arm had been repaired with remarkable craftsmanship. The repair fascinated him. Rather than hiding the crack, the carpenter had joined it with beautifully carved walnut pegs shaped like tiny leaves. The break had become part of the chair's story, not something to disguise, something to honor. He found that unexpectedly comforting. People, perhaps, deserved the same kindness. Exploring the shelves, he searched for any book still intact enough to read. Most crumbled the instant he touched them. One survived. Its leather cover had darkened almost to black. The pages remained fragile but legible. Opening it carefully, he discovered not grand theology or royal history, but a simple record. Visitors. Page after page listed names, dates, places they had traveled from, short notes beside many entries. Arrived weary. Recovered after fever. Prayed for his brother. Shared bread with strangers. Left smiling. Nothing miraculous. Nothing dramatic. Only ordinary lives, crossing briefly through the valley. Yet there were hundreds, perhaps thousands. The forgotten shrine had once welcomed travelers from every corner of the kingdom. One entry near the end caught his eye. The ink appeared newer than the others, not recent, but perhaps only 70 or 80 years old. Keeper Matthias departed today. May whoever finds this remember that no holy place belongs to stones alone. It belongs wherever kindness is offered. Below the message appeared no further entries, only blank pages. Aldrin closed the book gently. For several long moments, he remained silent. The valley had not been abandoned suddenly. Its caretakers had simply dwindled. One generation, then another, until only one remained. And eventually, even he had walked away. Or perhaps passed away. Either way, the silence had arrived gradually, like evening. Before leaving, Aldrin noticed one final object resting inside a small wooden drawer beneath the reading table, a folded map. Its edges had become brittle, but the ink still held. He spread it carefully across the table. The valley appeared in remarkable detail. The chapel, the gardens, the spring, the library, several buildings now lost, and farther north. A circle drawn into the hillside. Beside it, written in elegant script, were 3 words, House of Bells. Aldrin had never heard the name before. Yet beside it, someone had drawn a tiny symbol, an iron key, exactly like the one hanging from his belt. He smiled. The valley had just offered him another path, and somewhere beyond the northern woods, hidden among hills that had kept their secrets for centuries, another forgotten place was waiting patiently for a traveler carrying the right key. The map remained spread across the old reading table for several minutes, while Aldrin committed every line to memory. The parchment had yellowed with age, and one corner had been nibbled away by mice long ago, leaving an oddly artistic bite-shaped gap where part of the valley should have been. Fortunately, the missing section contained little more than woodland. At least, Aldrin hoped it did. It would have been rather inconvenient if the mouse had chosen the exact location of the mysterious House of Bells for its afternoon meal. He folded the map with slow, careful movements. The creases already carried the wear of many hands before his own, and he had no desire to become the person who accidentally tore apart the best guide the valley still possessed. Sliding it gently into his satchel, he took one last look around the little library. The shelves stood in dignified silence. The surviving book rested where he had found it. Dust floated lazily through the beam of sunlight, crossing the room. It occurred to him that every library, no matter how small, seemed to possess its own kind of breathing, not through lungs, through memory. Even abandoned books continued holding conversations with anyone patient enough to listen. He quietly closed the door behind him. The roses climbing the stone walls swayed in the breeze, as though nodding farewell. The northern trail began just beyond the library. Unlike the main path to the shrine, it climbed steadily through denser woodland. Ancient beeches gradually gave way to towering firs, whose trunks rose straight toward the sky before vanishing into dark green needles. The air grew cooler. The scent of pine resin became stronger. Every now and then, sunlight slipped through gaps overhead in bright columns that illuminated drifting pollen like tiny flecks of gold. The climb was gentle but constant. After an hour, Aldrin paused beside a broad rock to catch his breath. He wasn't exhausted, simply reminded that hills possessed a remarkable talent for making ordinary walking feel unexpectedly ambitious. He drank from his water skin and listened. Water trickled somewhere ahead. Wind whispered through pine branches. Far above, a hawk circled lazily on rising currents of warm air. Otherwise, the forest remained peaceful. He reached into his pouch and turned the iron key over in his hand. Its cool weight had become strangely reassuring. Not because he knew what it unlocked, because it reminded him that every discovery so far had led naturally to another. The valley seemed less interested in revealing secrets all at once than in teaching patience. His grandfather would have approved. The old man had once spent 3 days repairing a single cartwheel because, as he insisted, wood remembers whether you rushed. At the time, 12-year-old Aldrin had thought that sounded ridiculous. Now he wondered if wood truly did remember. If not wood, perhaps people certainly did. The trail curved around a steep hillside carpeted with moss. There he found another stone marker. This one stood taller than the others, nearly shoulder height. Its familiar lantern. Carving faced south toward the library. Below it, someone had carved a short sentence in careful lettering. Carry light with you, nothing more. Not seek light, not follow light. Carry it. The words settled quietly in his thoughts. Perhaps that was how the keepers of the valley had understood pilgrimage. Not searching for brightness somewhere far away, but bringing kindness wherever one happened to travel. Simple ideas often survived longer than complicated philosophies. By midday, the forest opened onto a broad meadow. Wild grasses rippled beneath the breeze in silver-green waves. Clusters of yellow flowers dotted the landscape, while butterflies wandered from blossom to blossom with impressive confidence, despite appearing to have no particular destination. Near the meadow's center stood several ancient apple trees. Unlike the sour fruit growing near the abandoned hamlet, these branches bent beneath large golden apples whose fragrance drifted pleasantly through the warm air. Aldrin hesitated, then noticed a weathered wooden sign. Its faded letters were still readable, for every traveler. He laughed softly. Well, I suppose refusing would be impolite. The apple proved wonderfully sweet, crisp, juicy, quite possibly the finest he had ever tasted. He briefly considered taking half a dozen for later, then remembered carrying half a dozen apples. Uphill would quickly transform delicious fruit into very respectable exercise equipment. He settled for 2. Wisdom occasionally prevailed. At the meadow's northern edge, he discovered the remains of a low stone wall. Beyond it stretched an orchard far larger than he had expected. Though untended, hundreds of fruit trees still survived. Pears, plums, cherries, hazelnuts. The forgotten community had planned carefully. Pilgrims passing through would never have gone hungry during harvest season. A curious thought crossed his mind. Many medieval monasteries had planted orchards not only for food, but because fruit trees could outlive the people who planted them by generations. An apple tree was, in a way, a promise to strangers one would never meet. He rather liked that idea. Plant something today whose shade belonged to someone else tomorrow. The afternoon passed quietly. Every so often he consulted the map, ensuring the trail still matched the faded lines. It did. The House of Bells lay somewhere ahead, beyond a ridge marked with tiny sketches of standing stones. Eventually, the standing stones appeared. There were 7 altogether, each taller than a man, each weathered into smooth, rounded shapes by countless winters. Unlike everything else in the valley, they bore no carvings, no symbols, no inscriptions, only silence. They formed a loose circle overlooking the northern forests. Aldrin stepped carefully among them. The place felt thoughtful. Not sacred exactly, reflective. The breeze moved differently here. When it passed between the stones, it produced faint musical tones, not bells, closer to the gentle humming of glass touched by wet fingertips. He smiled. So that explained why the map called the destination the House of Bells. Perhaps these stones had inspired the name centuries earlier, or perhaps the bells themselves lay nearby. He sat in the center of the circle for a while, allowing the quiet music of the wind to wash over him. Time became pleasantly difficult to measure. The sunlight shifted. Cloud shadows drifted across the hills. A family of deer emerged cautiously from the woods below, grazing without noticing the traveler, watching from above. No urgency pressed upon him. For the first time in years, Nowhere else required his attention. It was a rare feeling, one worth appreciating. As he prepared to continue, something caught his eye between two of the standing stones, a narrow staircase, carved directly into the hillside, almost invisible beneath moss and fern. It descended rather than climbed. The map had not shown it, or perhaps the ink had faded. Either way, the steps disappeared beneath the earth into cool shadow. Aldrin stood at the entrance for several moments. The air drifting upward carried the unmistakable scent of dry stone. Not caves, not damp earth, built stone, human craftsmanship. He rested one hand on the iron key. Then, with the calm curiosity that had carried him safely this far, he began descending into the hidden passage beneath the hill, wondering if, at last, the key had reached the door. It had been waiting centuries to open. The staircase descended more gradually than Aldrin expected. Rather than plunging deep beneath the hillside, it curved in broad, patient turns, each one revealing another stretch of carefully cut stone. Whoever had built it had taken great care to make the climb, or rather, the descent, as gentle as possible. That alone told him something. This passage had not been made for soldiers rushing into battle, nor for miners hauling heavy carts. It had been built for ordinary people, for pilgrims with weary legs, for elderly travelers leaning on walking staffs, for children who tired halfway through long journeys. He found that strangely comforting. The walls were cool beneath his fingertips. Though centuries old, the masonry remained remarkably solid. The stones fit together, so precisely that even a thin knife blade could scarcely have slipped between them. His grandfather would have admired the craftsmanship. He had always insisted that true skill revealed itself not in decoration, but in joints that refused to loosen. After perhaps 100 careful steps, the passage widened. Daylight still reached this far through a series of narrow shafts cut into the hillside above. The beams fell across the floor like long golden ribbons, illuminating tiny ferns that had somehow rooted themselves in cracks where moisture gathered. Nature, Aldrin thought, never truly stayed outside. It simply entered politely. At the end of the corridor stood a heavy oak door reinforced with black iron bands. Unlike the weathered doors of the chapel, this one remained almost perfectly preserved. No rot, no broken hinges, no ivy, only a thin layer of dust resting quietly across its surface. At its center gleamed a familiar keyhole. Aldrin stopped. For several heartbeats, he simply looked at it. Not because he doubted what came next, because moments anticipated for generations deserved a little respect. He removed the iron key from his belt. Its cool weight felt oddly familiar now, as though it had always belonged in his hand. The key slid into the lock without resistance, a perfect fit. He hesitated only long enough to draw a slow breath. Then he turned it. The mechanism answered with a deep, gentle click. Not loud, not dramatic, just the satisfied sound of something finally doing the job for which it had been made centuries earlier. Aldrin smiled. About time. The lock, having fulfilled its responsibilities admirably, remained wisely silent. He pushed. The heavy door swung inward, surprisingly easily. Cool, fresh air drifted out, carrying the faint scent of cedar wood and old wax. Beyond lay a circular chamber. Sunlight poured into it from an opening high in the domed ceiling, illuminating the room with warm afternoon light. Aldrin stood motionless, not from fear, from quiet amazement. The chamber had survived almost untouched. Stone shelves curved along the walls. Simple wooden cabinets remained neatly arranged. A broad table occupied the center. Everything wore a light, covering of dust, yet nothing appeared abandoned in haste. Instead, it felt as though the caretakers had expected to return after a very long journey. Around the room hung dozens of bronze bells, small ones, large ones, some no bigger than a clenched fist, others nearly the size of a bucket. Each rested upon its own carved wooden peg. None showed signs of damage. Aldrin stepped closer. Every bell bore an inscription, not names, virtues, patience, mercy, hope, humility, courage, joy. He gently touched the smallest. It gave a soft, clear tone that lingered beautifully in the chamber before fading into silence. One bell, one note, nothing more. Yet the sound somehow made the room feel less empty. A curious little fact drifted into his thoughts. Some medieval communities believed bells served purposes beyond marking the hours. Their tones welcomed travelers, warned of danger, celebrated harvests, comforted mourners, and reminded distant workers. They were not alone. Perhaps these bells had never been meant simply to ring. Perhaps they had carried reassurance across the valley. He walked slowly around the chamber. Above each bell hung a small painted panel. Not saints, not kings. Ordinary scenes. A woman sharing bread. A shepherd helping an injured lamb. Children planting a tree. A mason repairing a broken wall. A traveler offering water to another. Simple kindnesses. Nothing spectacular. Everything meaningful. He began to understand. The forgotten shrine had never centered upon miracles. Its greatest treasure had always been ordinary compassion, practiced faithfully. Near the far wall stood another cabinet. Inside rested dozens of neatly rolled parchments tied with faded ribbons. Carefully unrolling one, Aldrin discovered a collection of short writings, not sermons, instructions. Welcome every stranger before asking their name. Repair what you use. Leave wood for the next traveler. Listen twice before speaking once. Never let anyone depart hungry if bread remains. He smiled. There was practical wisdom in every line. No grand speeches, only habits capable of quietly changing lives. One parchment caught his attention more than the others. Its handwriting differed slightly, perhaps written by a later keeper. When people forget this place, do not mourn. If they remember kindness instead, the shrine still lives. Aldrin read the sentence twice, then a third time. He folded the parchment carefully. The valley suddenly made far more sense. The keepers had never tried to make themselves famous. They had hoped their actions would outlast their names. Judging by the stories the basket maker had shared, perhaps they had. At the center table rested a wooden box. Unlike the others, this one bore no dust. That puzzled him. Everything else had remained untouched for decades. He leaned closer. The surface had indeed been recently wiped clean. Not yesterday, not last week, but certainly within the past year. Someone else had visited. Very carefully, he lifted the lid. Inside lay fresh lavender, still fragrant. Beside it rested a small loaf of bread wrapped in linen, not moldy, not ancient, fresh enough to have been baked only a day or two earlier. Aldrin stared. He was no longer imagining another visitor. Someone was here, perhaps not at this exact moment, but somewhere within the valley, quietly maintaining at least one forgotten tradition. He looked around the chamber again. The bells, the shelves, the sunlight, the bread. Nothing felt threatening, only deeply mysterious. Then he noticed something else. On the central table, pressed gently into the thin layer of remaining dust beside the box, a single handprint, small, delicate, too small to belong to him. He slowly placed his own hand beside it, his fingers extended nearly an inch beyond the impression. Whoever had left it possessed slender hands, perhaps an elderly person, perhaps a woman, perhaps someone much younger than himself. The realization brought not fear, but anticipation. For days the valley had whispered that he was not entirely alone. Now, at last, it had offered proof. Somewhere beyond the quiet woods, another keeper still walked the forgotten paths, and Aldrin had the unmistakable feeling that before long their roads were destined to meet. Aldrin remained beside the wooden table for several moments, his eyes moving from the fresh loaf of bread to the delicate handprint pressed into the dust. The room had changed. Not physically. Nothing had moved. The bells still hung in perfect rows. Sunlight still streamed through the opening high above. The lavender still filled the chamber with its gentle fragrance. Yet, everything felt different. Until now, every discovery belonged to the past. Old roads, forgotten carvings, ancient records, centuries-old promises. This was different. Someone had been here recently. Someone who knew the hidden chamber. Someone who still cared enough to leave fresh bread where a weary traveler might find it. He smiled despite himself. "Thank you," he said softly. His voice echoed once beneath the dome before fading away. No answer came. Still, expressing gratitude felt appropriate. After all, whoever had left the bread had done so without expecting thanks. That made it all the more deserving. He broke off a small piece. The crust crackled pleasantly. The inside remained wonderfully soft. Barley and oat flour, he guessed, with perhaps a little rye. Simple, wholesome. Exactly the sort of loaf a village baker might proudly place on a wooden counter before dawn. It tasted of warmth and care. As he ate, his gaze wandered once more across the chamber. Near the bells stood a narrow staircase leading upward. Unlike the one he had descended, this stair was built of polished oak rather than stone. Its steps curved gently around the circular wall until disappearing through a round opening above. Naturally, curiosity spoke first. His common sense sighed and followed behind. The climb was short. 20 steps, perhaps 25. At the top, he emerged into another room, smaller, brighter. Its walls were lined with tall windows looking out across the northern forests. From here, the valley unfolded like an illuminated manuscript. The chapel rested among the trees below. The orchard spread across gentle slopes. Farther away shimmered the spring, where he had first glimpsed the pale figure days earlier. The standing stones crowned the ridge to the south. Only now did Aldrin understand. The House of Bells was not merely hidden. It watched over the entire valley. Not in the sense of guarding, rather witnessing, like an old shepherd keeping quiet watch over familiar hills. The upper room contained almost no furniture. A single writing desk stood beside the eastern window. An empty chair rested before it. A shelf held several clay jars labeled in faded ink. Goose feathers, lamp oil, beeswax, fresh parchment. His eyebrows lifted. Fresh. The parchment showed none of the yellowing or brittleness of the older documents below. Someone replenished these supplies. Regularly. Beside the ink pot lay a folded sheet. Unlike the ancient manuscripts, this page appeared recently written. The handwriting flowed with remarkable elegance. Aldrin hesitated, then unfolded it. It contained only one sentence. "If you have come seeking treasure, you have already walked past it. No signature, no explanation." He laughed quietly. Fair enough. Looking back through the window, he suddenly realized the sentence was true. The treasure had never been hidden beneath floors or locked inside chests. It had surrounded him since entering the valley. The orchards, the shelter, the kindness preserved in forgotten habits, the careful repairs, the welcome left for strangers. These things required no gold, only faithful hands. A curious medieval custom came to mind. Some monasteries once measured wealth not by coin, but by how many travelers they could feed through winter. It was a simple calculation. The more mouths welcomed, the richer the house. By that measure, this forgotten valley had once been astonishingly wealthy. His attention shifted toward another object resting on the desk, a leather-bound ledger. Unlike the visitor's book in the library, this one remained almost empty. Opening it carefully, he found only a handful of entries, each separated by years. Roof repaired after heavy snow. 3 pear trees replanted. Bell of Mercy recast. Bridge strengthened before autumn rains. The most recent entry bore no date. Simply, another traveler has found the road. Aldrin froze, fresh ink, barely dry. He instinctively turned toward the doorway. Empty. His heartbeat quickened, not with alarm, but with the unmistakable awareness that whoever maintained the valley knew he was here. Perhaps they had known from the moment he crossed the old bridge. He stepped quietly into the hallway. Nothing, only silence. Returning to the desk, he looked more closely. There, beside the ledger, rested a small sprig of fresh rosemary, still green, still fragrant. No breeze had carried that indoors. Someone had placed it there intentionally, very recently. He smiled. "You're quite good at disappearing." The room answered only with birdsong, drifting through the open windows. Eventually, he descended once more into the bell chamber. This time, he noticed something he had overlooked earlier. Each bell hung beside a neatly carved wooden peg. One peg remained empty. A brass plaque beneath it read, "Welcome." There had once been another bell, not lost through theft, removed carefully. Its absence seemed deliberate. He wondered where it had gone. Perhaps it had cracked. Perhaps it still rang somewhere else in the valley. As he examined the empty peg, a faint sound drifted through the chamber. Not from within, from outside. A bell, very distant. One clear note. Then another, soft enough to mingle with the wind. Aldrin stood motionless. The sound came again, gentle, unhurried. Not the loud peal of a church tower, more like a handbell carried by someone walking slowly through the woods. He hurried to the doorway. The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the western hills. Long shadows stretched across the meadow. Again, the bell rang, this time slightly closer. He followed the sound up the hillside until reaching the standing stones. The breeze whispered between them as before. The bell rang once more, beyond the circle, among the trees. He caught movement, not merely imagined this time. A pale cloak slipping gracefully between the trunks. Whoever wore it moved calmly, neither hiding nor waiting, simply walking. Aldrin called out, "Hello." The figure paused, only for a heartbeat, then continued deeper into the forest, not fleeing, inviting. Without another thought, Aldrin followed. The trail wound gently beneath towering pines. The bell sounded every so often ahead, never hurried, always just enough to guide him onward. Branches parted. Sunlight flickered through needles overhead. For nearly half an hour, he walked without once catching more than a fleeting glimpse of the pale cloak. At last, the forest opened into a quiet clearing. In its center stood a modest stone cottage surrounded by herbs, vegetables, and flowering lavender. Thin smoke curled lazily from its chimney. Fresh bread cooled upon a wooden windowsill, and hanging beside the front door was the missing bell. Its polished bronze gleamed warmly in the late afternoon light. Before Aldrin could take another step, the cottage door opened. An elderly woman with silver hair and kind gray eyes looked at him as though she had been expecting him all along. She smiled gently. "I wondered," she said, "how long it would take you to find the bread." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The old woman remained standing in the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the weathered oak frame, while Aldrin stood at the edge of the herb garden, trying to decide whether to apologize for following her, thank her for the bread, or ask the 1,000 questions that had collected in his mind over the past several days. His thoughts, unfortunately, attempted all three at once. The result was an expression that looked rather like someone who had misplaced both his hat and his common sense. The woman laughed softly. It was a warm laugh, free of mockery. "I promise," she said, "there is no examination." Aldrin smiled sheepishly. "That's fortunate. I never did enjoy examinations." "You've had them?" "Oh, certainly." She nodded toward the cottage. "Life gives them regularly. I've simply stopped trying to pass perfectly." There was wisdom in that sentence, the sort of wisdom that sounded almost obvious until one considered how rarely people actually lived by it. She stepped aside. "Come in." The cottage was modest. A single large room served as kitchen, sitting room, and workshop. Everything had its place. Bundles of drying herbs hung from dark ceiling beams. Shelves held carefully labeled clay jars. A spinning wheel rested beside the hearth. Fresh loaves of bread cooled upon a wooden rack near the window. The entire room smelled of rosemary, honey, cedar, and warm barley flour. It felt immediately welcoming. Not because it was grand, because someone had loved it for many years. The old woman placed a kettle over the fire. "I am called Gisela." "Aldrin." "I know." He blinked. "You know my name?" She smiled while arranging two simple pottery cups upon the table. "Your grandfather visited." The words landed gently, yet they echoed through him. "My grandfather?" "Edric." "You knew him?" "I did. He came here, many years ago." Aldrin slowly sat down. "He never told me." Gisela chuckled. "He wouldn't." "Why not?" "Because I asked him not to." That answer raised even more questions than it settled. Steam began curling from the kettle. Gisela added handfuls of mint, chamomile, and a few crushed lavender blossoms before pouring the fragrant infusion into the waiting cups. She offered one to Aldrin. "Careful. It remembers the fire." He accepted it gratefully. The warmth settled pleasantly into his hands. For several quiet moments, they drank without speaking. Outside, bees drifted lazily through the lavender. Somewhere nearby, chickens clucked with great seriousness about matters known only to chickens. Finally, Aldrin spoke. "My grandfather gave me the stone." Gisela nodded. "I expected he would. He told me to find the forgotten shrine, and yet he never explained why." "No, he probably couldn't." Aldrin looked up. "What do you mean?" She folded her hands together. "Each keeper chose only one person to remember enough. Not everything, just enough to continue the road. The rest had to be discovered. Otherwise, people would inherit answers instead of understanding." He considered that. It sounded frustrating, yet somehow also reasonable. If his grandfather had simply handed him directions, would he have noticed the kindness preserved throughout the valley? Or would he have hurried straight to the destination, missing the journey entirely? Perhaps the road had always been part of the lesson. Gisela rose and crossed to a tall cupboard. From its upper shelf, she carefully removed a carved wooden box. Unlike the one Aldrin had found beneath the altar, this box gleamed with fresh polish. She placed it gently upon the table. Inside rested dozens of small stone tokens. Each carried the familiar archway wrapped in vines, exactly like his own. Some appeared ancient, others surprisingly new. Aldrin reached toward one. So there were many. One for every keeper. And every pilgrim? No, she smiled. Only those willing to become both. He frowned thoughtfully. I don't understand. You will. That seemed to be the valley's favorite answer. He was beginning to suspect every resident had attended the same school of mysterious conversation. Perhaps there had once been evening classes. Speaking clearly for beginners had evidently not survived the curriculum. Ysela seemed to read his thoughts. "I know," she laughed. "We sound terribly cryptic." "A little. We don't mean to." She selected one of the older tokens. When the shrine flourished, pilgrims came seeking miracles. They often left disappointed. Not because miracles never happened, but because they arrived looking in the wrong direction. She turned the token over. What they remembered years later was rarely the prayer. It was the stranger who shared bread, the roof repaired before the rain, the warm bed, the listening ear, the guide who walked beside them. The miracle was almost always another person. Aldrin looked quietly into his cup. The words settled deeply. They matched everything he had seen throughout the valley. The orchard, the library, the bells, the simple instructions preserved on parchment. Nothing had celebrated greatness. Everything had honored kindness. Ysela stood again. "Come." She led him outside. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the herb garden. Beside the cottage stood a small workshop. Inside, neatly arranged upon wooden benches, lay tools of every kind: axes, planes, needles, hammers. Shovels. None looked ceremonial. Everyone showed signs of careful use. The keepers built. They cooked. They planted. They copied books. They repaired roads. They welcomed strangers. They buried the dead. They mended roofs. They learned whatever the valley needed. She rested one hand upon an old carpenter's plane. We never separated ordinary work from sacred work. Aldrin ran his fingers across the smooth wooden handle. It fit comfortably in his hand. His own father had taught him to use nearly identical tools. "You were a wheelwright." Ysela said it so casually that Aldrin barely noticed at first. Then he looked up sharply. "How did you know?" She smiled. "Your hands." He looked down. The calluses along his palms suddenly seemed obvious. Years of shaping timber had left their quiet signature. She nodded approvingly. "Good. You already know how to care for things. The valley has always needed people like that." A curious fact came to her mind. Did you know that in some medieval monasteries, the finest craftsmen were often assigned to repair humble objects before important ones? Aldrin shook his head. Why? Because repairing an ordinary stool with patience taught the same virtues as restoring an altar, only with fewer people watching. He smiled. He liked that very much. As evening approached, they walked together toward the ridge overlooking the valley. From there, the forgotten shrine glowed softly beneath the golden light of sunset. Smoke from the cottage chimney drifted peacefully upward. The orchards shimmered in the breeze. Far below, swallows circled the chapel tower. Ysela stood silently for a long while. Then she spoke. "I am old." Aldrin said nothing. "I have cared for this valley many years. Longer than I expected." She turned toward him. "When your grandfather came, I hoped he would stay. He couldn't. He had a family waiting. He promised to send another when the time was right." Her eyes rested kindly upon him. "I believe that time has arrived." The words were not spoken as a command, nor even as a request, simply as quiet recognition. Aldrin looked out across the valley once more. The forgotten shrine, the orchards, the library, the house of bells, the roads patiently waiting for future travelers. He suddenly understood why the valley had never truly felt abandoned. Someone had always remained, not to guard treasures, but to keep kindness alive until another pair of willing hands arrived. The evening breeze stirred gently through the lavender. Below them, the bell beside Ysela's cottage rang once in the wind. Its clear note drifted across the valley, not calling people to gather, simply reminding the quiet hills that someone was still home. The next morning began with the pleasant aroma of fresh bread, long before the sun climbed above the eastern ridge. Eldrin awoke to the soft rhythm of someone kneading dough, not hurriedly, not mechanically. Each movement carried the quiet confidence of a task performed thousands of times before. He stepped outside just as the first golden light touched the tops of the pines. The valley shimmered beneath a thin veil of mist. Tiny droplets clung to lavender blossoms surrounding the cottage, each reflecting the sunrise like a miniature jewel. Sella stood beside a broad wooden table beneath a small awning, dusting flour from her hands. "You slept well." "I did. The valley usually allows that." She smiled, as though speaking of an old friend with dependable habits. She handed him a warm roll, fresh from the oven. Steam curled into the cool morning air as he broke it open. Butter, made from goat's milk, melted instantly into the soft crumb. He closed his eyes after the first bite. "I may never leave." Gisela laughed. Many pilgrims have said exactly that. And most eventually remembered they had goats waiting somewhere. Aldrin nodded solemnly. Goats have a remarkable talent for insisting upon responsibility. They do. They're quite gifted at it. After breakfast, Sella disappeared into the workshop and returned carrying 2 woven baskets. One she handed to Aldrin. "We're working today." He looked inside, pruning shears, twine, a small hand trowel, gardening gloves stitched from soft leather. Not exactly the equipment of a legendary quest. He found that oddly reassuring. Together they walked toward the old orchard. Morning birds darted between branches, filling the air with cheerful chatter. The sweet scent of ripening fruit drifted on every breeze. Many of the trees remained healthy, despite decades of neglect, but several younger saplings struggled beneath tangled vines and broken limbs. Gisela knelt beside one bent pear tree. "What do you see?" Aldrin studied it carefully. "A broken branch." "Good. What else?" "The roots look healthy." She nodded. "And?" He crouched lower. "The trunk is still strong." "Exactly." She handed him the pruning shears. "Never mistake damage for ruin." As he carefully removed the splintered branch, her words lingered in his thoughts. The lesson clearly extended beyond gardening. Some wounds required removal before new growth could begin. Others simply needed time. By midday, they had worked through nearly half the orchard. Dead limbs became neat piles of firewood. Young shoots received fresh support from carefully tied stakes. Fallen fruit was gathered into baskets for cider. Nothing was wasted. Sella paused beside one especially ancient apple tree whose trunk had hollowed with age. "You know," she said, patting the bark affectionately, "this tree stopped bearing fruit 15 years ago." Aldrin glanced upward. "But it's covered in apples." "Exactly." He looked puzzled. She grinned. "I was wrong. There are advantages to admitting such things." The tree, apparently pleased with its victory, dropped a single apple onto the grass beside them. Aldrin picked it up. "I suppose it wished to contribute. Or correct me personally." By early afternoon, they carried several baskets of herbs toward the old chapel. As they climbed the familiar stone staircase, Aldrin noticed the place looked subtly different, not transformed, simply cared for. The swept courtyard remained tidy. The herbs growing between paving stones had been trimmed. Fresh flowers rested in the stone basin beside the entrance. He frowned. "I didn't place those." "No." "Did you?" Gisela shook her head. "The valley did." He laughed. "I suspect that's not literally true." "No. But someone passes this way almost every day." She said it casually, as though speaking about the weather. Inside the chapel, sunlight streamed through broken roof tiles exactly as before. Yet now, with fresh flowers beside the altar and the lingering scent of rosemary drifting through the room, the building felt less abandoned than merely quiet between visitors. Gisela walked slowly along the wall, where generations of pilgrims had carved their names. She rested her fingertips lightly upon the stone. Some people believe memory lives in books, she smiled. I think it also lives in places touched with care. Aldrin nodded. He understood now. The chapel had survived not because its stones were unusually strong. It had survived because someone had continued sweeping its floor, mending its roof when possible, and leaving flowers where beauty was needed. Ordinary acts, repeated faithfully. Near the entrance, Gisela stopped beside the circular stone compass he had discovered days earlier. She knelt and brushed away a few fallen leaves. You noticed this? I did. What do you think it means? He studied the carving. The roads? In part. She pointed toward the 8 lines radiating from the center. Pilgrims believed these represented every direction a traveler might take after leaving. The shrine was never meant to keep people here. It prepared them to return home. Aldrin looked thoughtfully at the worn stone. So many sacred places spoke of arriving. Very few spoke of leaving well. That seemed somehow more difficult. A curious historical tradition came to Gisela's mind. In some old communities, she said, pilgrims received walking staffs carved with tiny notches, not to prove where they had been, but to remind them that the journey continued. I like that. So did they. Outside, clouds drifted lazily across the afternoon sky. Together, they carried tools toward one corner of the chapel roof, where several loose shingles had slipped during winter storms. The repair was modest, replacing broken pegs, sliding weathered oak shingles back into place, hammering carefully to avoid cracking the old timber. Aldrin found himself smiling throughout the work, not because it was easy, because it was familiar. Wood responded predictably. Patience mattered. Precision mattered. Rushing never helped. The chapel seemed almost grateful for the attention. When they climbed down, Gisela examined the finished repair. It should hold. For another decade, perhaps. With luck. She looked toward him. Luck helps. But maintenance helps more. He laughed. I've always suspected that. As evening approached, they returned once more to the ridge overlooking the valley. Smoke rose peacefully from the cottage. The bell at the House of Bells gleamed in the golden light. The orchard stretched quietly beneath them. Travelers no longer filled the roads. The great pilgrimages had faded into history. Yet somehow, the valley no longer seemed lonely. It felt patient, waiting. Gisela folded her hands before her. There will be others. You believe so? I know so. Roads never truly disappear. They simply wait until someone chooses to walk them again. Aldrin followed her gaze toward the old southern path, disappearing beyond the distant hills. For the first time since leaving his village, he found himself wondering not when he would return home, but how many future travelers might one day stand exactly where he stood now, carrying burdens of their own, grateful to discover that somewhere in a forgotten valley, someone had cared enough to leave bread, shelter, and kindness waiting for them. The thought settled warmly in his heart. Perhaps that had always been the shrine's greatest purpose, not preserving the past. Preparing quiet, welcome for the future. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm so naturally that Aldrin almost forgot he had ever measured life by village bells and market days. Morning began with bread, afternoon belonged to work, evening ended with quiet conversation beneath a sky slowly filling with stars. There was comfort in the repetition, not the dull comfort of doing the same thing, because nothing ever changed, but the peaceful certainty that worthwhile work always waited. One morning, they repaired a section of the old stone staircase where frost had loosened several steps. The next day, they cleared fallen branches from the southern path. Another afternoon disappeared pleasantly while replacing broken shelves in the little library. Every task was small. Together, they became something much larger. Aldrin began noticing details that would once have escaped him entirely. The way ivy naturally protected certain walls from harsh winter winds. How the orchard drew birds that quietly kept insects from damaging the fruit. The spring never ran dry, even after several warm afternoons. Nothing in the valley seemed accidental. Generations of thoughtful hands had shaped it with remarkable patience. One crisp morning, while gathering firewood near the forest edge, Aldrin found a young oak sapling growing directly through the middle of the old road. It stood no taller than his waist, healthy, straight, determined. He rested his axe on his shoulder and stared at it. Yasela, walking a few steps behind, noticed his hesitation. "You could cut it." "I could. You won't." He smiled. "No." She nodded approvingly. "What will you do?" "We'll move the road." She laughed. "I hoped you'd say that." So they did. Using shovels and simple hand tools, they guided the footpath around the little tree instead of removing it. The work took most of the afternoon. When they finished, the road curved gently beneath the young branches. Years from now, travelers would probably assume it had always followed that route. Few would ever realize the path had bent to spare one growing tree. Aldrin found quiet satisfaction in that. Not every obstacle deserved removal. Sometimes wisdom simply walked around it. A curious medieval custom came to Wisela's mind as they packed away their tools. "In some old forests," she said, "road builders deliberately left certain ancient trees standing, even when it meant extra work. Why? They believed travelers needed shade more than straight roads." Aldrin looked up into the spreading branches overhead. "I think they were right." "So do I." Later that week, the first unexpected visitor arrived. Not a pilgrim seeking miracles, not a wandering noble. Just an elderly shepherd searching for 2 missing sheep. He stumbled into the valley shortly before sunset, exhausted, hungry, and more embarrassed than worried. "I've been chasing those woolly fools since dawn," he sighed. "They've developed independent political opinions." Aldrin blinked. "Political opinions? They've voted in favor of ignoring me." Gisela offered him warm stew without asking another question. The shepherd accepted gratefully. His sheep, it turned out, had wandered into the orchard where they appeared perfectly content. One had somehow managed to wedge its head inside a berry bush while pursuing leaves clearly positioned just beyond sensible reach. Aldrin carefully freed the animal. The sheep looked at him briefly, then immediately resumed eating, not even a hint of gratitude. He shook his head. "You're fortunate you're covered in wool." The shepherd chuckled. "They've survived for centuries entirely because humans possess astonishing patience." After supper, the old man prepared to leave. Gisela handed him a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "For tomorrow," he hesitated. "I have no coin." "We weren't selling." His eyes softened. "You keep the old ways." "We try." The shepherd looked around the peaceful valley. "People still speak of this place." "They do?" "Not often, but kindly." He smiled before leading his sheep back toward the southern road. "That's enough." After he disappeared beyond the trees, Aldrin remained thoughtful. The shrine had already begun receiving travelers again. Not crowds, not yet, but enough to matter. Several days later, another visitor arrived. A young widow carrying her small daughter. The child's sandal had broken miles earlier. Without hesitation, Aldrin sat upon the chapel steps, removed the worn leather straps, and repaired them using scraps from his own pack. The little girl watched every movement with enormous concentration. When he finished, she stamped each foot proudly upon the stones. "They're better than before," he grinned. "I had excellent materials." Her mother smiled with quiet relief. They rested beneath the ash tree while sharing bread and apples before continuing their journey. As they departed, the little girl waved enthusiastically. "I'll remember your tree," Aldrin laughed. "My tree. The one you walked around." She pointed toward the young oak beside the road. Children, he realized, remembered exactly the details adults overlooked. That pleased him. One cool evening, while replacing loose shingles on the chapel roof, Aldrin paused to admire the view. Smoke drifted peacefully from Ysella's cottage. The orchard glowed beneath the setting sun. Birds circled lazily above the bell tower. The valley no longer felt forgotten. Quiet, yes. Hidden, certainly. Forgotten, perhaps not. Below, he noticed two travelers climbing the old staircase. Merchants by the look of them. They reached the courtyard, stopped, and simply stood looking around. One removed his cap. The other smiled. Neither spoke for a long moment. Finally, one whispered, almost to himself, "So it really exists." Aldrin remained where he was. He felt no need for grand introductions. The valley could welcome them perfectly well on its own. That evening, the merchants shared stories over simple stew. They spoke of distant towns, flooded bridges, excellent cheese in one northern village, terrible cheese in another. Apparently, medieval trade involved surprisingly detailed opinions regarding dairy products. Aldrin wisely avoided taking sides. Before leaving the next morning, one merchant asked, "Who owns this place?" Ysella looked toward Aldrin, then back to the traveler. "No one. We simply care for it." The merchant nodded slowly, as though that answer somehow made perfect sense. After they departed, Aldrin found himself standing once more beside the ancient stone basin near the chapel entrance. Fresh flowers floated upon the water. Sunlight reflected gently across its surface. He reached into his pouch and removed the stone token his grandfather had given him all those years before. For the first time since beginning his journey, he no longer wondered why it had belonged to his family. The token had never been a key to hidden treasure. It had been an invitation to continue something quiet, something ordinary, something that mattered precisely because it asked for no applause. He slipped it back beneath his tunic. The familiar weight rested against his heart. It no longer felt like an unanswered question. It felt like home. Autumn settled gently across the valley. It did not arrive all at once with a single cold morning or a dramatic gust of wind stripping every tree bare. Instead, it appeared patiently, one golden leaf at a time. The orchard blushed with shades of amber and crimson. The ivy climbing the chapel walls deepened into rich burgundy. Each dawn arrived a little cooler than the one before, and every evening invited the fire to burn a little longer. Aldrin had long since stopped counting the days. The rhythm of the valley had quietly replaced the calendar. When the apples were ready, they gathered apples. When rain loosened stones along the southern road, they repaired them. When travelers arrived, they welcomed them. Time was measured by needs rather than numbers. One crisp morning, Ysella handed Aldrin a small notebook bound in faded leather. "I think it's yours now." He opened it carefully. The first pages contained familiar entries written in her elegant hand. Roof mended before winter. Bridge repaired after spring floods. 3 travelers sheltered during heavy rain. Near the end, the remaining pages were blank. He looked up. "The keeper's ledger." She nodded. "It isn't meant to record great events." "What should it record?" "The small ones." He smiled. "They seem to be the important ones." "They usually are." That afternoon, he made his first entry. A young oak was spared. The road learned a kinder curve. Nothing more. The sentence pleased him. Simple, honest, true. Over the following weeks, the valley welcomed a quiet procession of unexpected guests. A traveling mason, whose cart axle had broken. Two sisters making pilgrimage to a distant abbey. A scholar searching for old manuscripts who stayed only long enough to copy a single page from the library before thanking them with remarkable sincerity. Even a young apprentice blacksmith arrived carrying a sack of tools nearly as large as himself. He insisted he could repair the cracked iron bracket supporting one of the chapel doors. It took him most of the afternoon. His first attempt leaned noticeably to one side. His second was only slightly better. The third fit perfectly. He stepped back proudly. There, Gisela examined the finished work. It will outlast us. The apprentice grinned. I hope so. As he departed the next morning, Aldrin quietly slipped a fresh loaf of bread into the young man's pack while he wasn't looking. Halfway down the staircase, the apprentice discovered it. He turned around. You forgot this. Aldrin smiled. No. The young blacksmith looked confused for a heartbeat. Then understanding slowly spread across his face. He bowed slightly before continuing down the road. No further explanation was necessary. The custom had found another traveler. One evening, while sorting apples inside the old storehouse, Aldrin asked the question that had lingered in his thoughts for weeks. Did you ever want to leave? Gisela continued arranging baskets before answering. Many times. He waited. When I was young, I imagined distant cities, great monasteries, royal courts, busy harbors. She laughed softly. I pictured life becoming terribly exciting. And? I visited most of them. His eyebrows rose. You left? For several years. I always returned. Why? She rested one hand upon a weathered apple crate. Because I eventually understood the difference between being entertained. She looked toward the chapel, visible through the open doorway, and being needed. The words settled quietly between them. Aldrin thought of his village, of broken wagon wheels, of neighbors helping during harvest, of Marta's gentle smile before he departed. Perhaps every place needed someone willing to stay. Not because staying was easier, because belonging carried responsibilities that wandering could not. The first frost arrived before dawn. One clear morning, tiny crystals covered every blade of grass. The orchard glittered beneath the rising sun. Aldrin walked slowly through the valley, admiring how the light transformed even the simplest spiderweb into delicate silver lace. At the spring, he found a familiar sight. Fresh footprints, small, bare, just as he had seen weeks earlier after the rain. This time they continued beyond the water instead of disappearing. He followed them curiously. They led toward the chapel, then around it, finally stopping beside the ancient ash tree. There, hanging from one low branch, swayed a tiny woven circle of willow, exactly like the charm the basket maker had given him on the road. Only newer, freshly woven. No note accompanied it, no explanation. He smiled. Perhaps the old basket maker had found his way back, or perhaps another traveler had learned the custom elsewhere. Either possibility pleased him. He left the little circle untouched. Some gifts belonged to everyone. That afternoon, while replacing firewood beside Wisela's cottage, they heard distant voices. Not one traveler. Several. By sunset, 5 pilgrims climbed the old staircase together. Their boots were muddy, their cloaks damp from crossing rivers. One leaned heavily upon a walking stick. Another carried a sleeping child wrapped warmly against the evening chill. They stopped in the courtyard, exactly as so many before them had done. One quietly whispered, "We found it." Gisela looked toward Aldrin. Without speaking, both of them simply began preparing supper. More bread, another pot of stew, extra blankets, additional places around the fire, no ceremony, no speeches, only welcome. As darkness settled across the valley, laughter drifted gently from the chapel for the first time in many years. Stories followed, simple ones, about long roads, rainy weather, friendly inns, stubborn mules. One pilgrim claimed his mule possessed such remarkable confidence that it regularly ignored maps. Another replied that maps occasionally deserved ignoring. The debate continued with impressive seriousness. Even Gisela laughed until tears formed in her eyes. Later that night, after everyone had fallen asleep, Aldrin stepped quietly outside. The stars stretched brilliantly across the autumn sky. The bell beside the cottage moved gently in the cool breeze. One soft note floated into the darkness. He looked down across the valley. Warm light glowed from the chapel windows. Smoke curled peacefully upward. The orchard rested beneath moonlight. The forgotten shrine was forgotten no longer, not because crowds had returned, not because kings had rediscovered it, but because kindness, once offered again, had a remarkable habit of finding its own way along forgotten roads. Aldrin placed one hand over the small stone token beneath his tunic. His grandfather's promise had nearly been fulfilled. Only one final step remained, and somehow he already knew it would not involve hidden chambers or ancient secrets. It would be something quieter, something worthy of the valley that had patiently taught him where true treasure had always been. Winter announced itself not with a roar, but with a whisper. One morning, Aldrin opened the cottage door to find the valley covered in a thin blanket of snow. Every tree branch wore a delicate white outline. The orchard stood silent beneath its frosted canopy, and the old chapel looked as though it had been wrapped in a cloak stitched from clouds. He stepped outside carefully. The snow gave a satisfying crunch beneath his boots. The cold air filled his lungs with such crisp freshness that he instinctively smiled. Behind him, Gisela emerged carrying 2 steaming mugs. "I thought you might stay out here a while. You know me well. I've had practice." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the first sunlight spread across the valley. Snow transformed familiar places. The worn stone staircase looked newly carved. The old graveyard rested peacefully beneath smooth white mounds. Even the ivy climbing the chapel walls seemed gentler beneath its icy covering. Nothing appeared abandoned. Everything simply rested. That morning they walked the southern road, brushing fresh snow from the stone markers so travelers would still recognize the way. At each carved archway, Aldrin paused only long enough to clear the moss and snow before moving on. Simple work, necessary work, the kind of task no one would ever praise. Exactly the sort of work the valley had always valued. By midday they heard voices. A family of 4 approached carefully through the snow. A father carrying a sleeping boy upon his shoulders. A mother leading a little girl bundled so thoroughly in wool that she resembled a determined walking blanket. The child stopped beside one of the carved markers. She pointed toward the vine-covered archway. "What does it mean?" Her father looked uncertain. Before he could answer, Aldrin knelt beside the stone. "It means you're welcome." The little girl smiled. "I like that." "So do I." She reached out with mittened hands and gently brushed the last bit of snow from the carving before skipping after her parents. Aldrin watched her go. Children, he thought again, often understood symbols better than adults. That evening the chapel filled with quiet life. The family shared supper beside the fire. The little boy awoke just long enough to eat 2 bowls of stew and declare it the best in the whole kingdom. His parents apologized. Gisela merely laughed. Hunger is an excellent cook. After everyone had settled for the night, Aldrin opened the keeper's ledger. He dipped a quill into fresh ink and added another line. A child remembered the meaning of the gate. He closed the book with quiet satisfaction. The small entries now stretched across several pages. No heroic victories, no famous names, only moments, each one as ordinary as bread, each one, somehow, enough. Several weeks passed peacefully. Travelers came, travelers departed. The valley remained what it had always been, a place where strangers became guests before they became stories. One cold afternoon, while repairing a loose shutter on the library, Aldrin noticed Isella watching the hills from her favorite bench. She seemed content, peaceful. The winter sun rested warmly across her silver hair. He joined her. "What are you thinking about?" She smiled without looking away from the valley. "How wonderfully unnecessary I have become." He frowned. "I don't understand. I used to believe everything depended on me." She laughed softly. "It never did." She turned toward him. "The valley doesn't belong to its keeper. The keeper belongs to the valley. And valleys are patient. They always find another pair of hands." Aldrin looked across the orchards, the chapel, the house of bells, the winding road disappearing into distant woods. He finally understood. This had never been about replacing Wisela. It had always been about joining something that had begun long before either of them had been born. Something that, with care, would continue long after both were gone. Spring would eventually return. Other keepers would come. New travelers would walk forgotten roads. The promise would simply continue. As evening approached, they climbed together to the ridge, overlooking the entire valley. One final time before the year's deepest snows arrived. The bell beside the cottage chimed gently in the breeze. Below them, thin trails of smoke rose from both the chapel and the cottage. Warm lights glowed in their windows. Far down the southern road, two tiny figures could just be seen approaching through the fading light. More travelers. Still coming, still searching, still hoping. Isella rested one hand lightly on Aldrin's shoulder. "You've noticed something." He nodded. "I have." "What is it?" "The shrine was never forgotten." She smiled. "No. It was simply waiting for someone to remember." Neither spoke again for a long while. There was nothing left that required words. The valley itself seemed to complete every unfinished sentence. The wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. An owl called from the western woods. The bell answered softly. As darkness settled over the hills, Aldrin felt the familiar stone token resting against his heart. For years he had believed it pointed toward a destination. Now he understood. It had always pointed toward a way of living, to welcome before questioning, to repair before replacing, to plant trees whose shade you might never sit beneath, to leave bread for strangers, to keep roads open, to remember quiet kindness when louder deeds demanded attention. Those things, he realized, were stronger than stone walls, longer lasting than names carved into monuments, and easier to carry than any treasure. The fire in the chapel burned warmly that night. Fresh bread cooled upon the cottage windowsill. The bell waited patiently beside the door. Far beyond the valley, countless roads wound through forests, villages, and distant hills. Sooner or later, another weary traveler would choose the quieter path. They would discover the old stone markers, climb the worn staircase, push open the weathered chapel door. Someone would greet them with warm food, a listening ear, and a place to rest. The promise would continue, not because anyone commanded it, because kindness, once given freely, has a remarkable way of teaching itself to the next pair of willing hands. And somewhere, carried gently on the evening breeze, the forgotten shrine remembered every traveler who had remembered it in return. The snow continued falling long after the valley had grown quiet. It settled softly upon the chapel roof, the orchard branches, and the winding road that disappeared into the sleeping forest. Inside, the fire crackled with a slow, comforting rhythm, wrapping stone walls and old wooden beams in gentle warmth. If you imagine yourself standing there for just a little longer, you can almost hear the distant bell, not calling anyone in particular, but simply reminding the world that somewhere, someone has kept a light burning through the night. Perhaps tomorrow another traveler will arrive. Perhaps not. Either way, the bread will be baked. The path will remain clear. The herbs will grow again in spring. The apple trees will bloom. The books will wait patiently on their shelves. The quiet work will continue, one ordinary kindness at a time. There is something deeply comforting in knowing that not every important place must be famous, and not every meaningful life must be remembered by history. Sometimes the greatest gifts are offered without expectation, preserved not in songs or monuments, but in warm meals, repaired roofs, open doors, and gentle words shared with strangers who soon become friends. So let your thoughts become as peaceful as the falling snow. Let the valley grow still around you. Let the soft glow from the chapel windows fade into the distance as the stars quietly fill the winter sky. And if, someday in a dream, you happen to find yourself walking a forgotten road beneath ancient trees, perhaps you'll recognize the little stone markers wrapped in vines. If you do, you'll know that you've found a place where kindness is always waiting. Sleep peacefully. The road can wait until morning.